Denver. This is a serious incident of police repression, like my comrade Sean said, against organizers for justice, against the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and against the mass movement for Black lives across the country. When I heard about our comrades in Denver who were targeted and arrested, when I heard about how they were targeted and arrested in a parking lot of a Home Depot, pulled over while driving, and with SWAT cars surrounding their home, when I heard about the seriousness and the seriously false felony charges that are being brought against them, I thought about our revolutionary ancestors, Assata Shakur, Fred Hampton, Malcolm X, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and so many more leaders and organizers that were targeted, arrested, and on false charges and assassinated. And there's so many more examples like that in our history. There's a deep and long history of police and state repression of radical Black movements for justice and liberation. And we have to ground ourselves in the reality that this is a tactic of the state to remove and or incarcerate our key organizers and leaders in an attempt to shake, destabilize, and kill the movement. We have to continue to resist and remain organized, steadfast, and disciplined, and as determined as ever. One of the charges waged against Assata Shakur, amongst a list of completely bogus charges, was kidnapping, something that one of our comrades is being accused of now, for exercising their right to protest by surrounding a police precinct to demand that the officers who brutally murdered Elijah McClain last year be fired and arrested and brought to justice. At the time, Assata Shakur was politically educating and awakening the youth with the Black Panther Party and coordinating their other work to serve the needs of the community and stand up to the corrupt ruling class, which is exactly what our comrades were doing. They were organizing mass protests and mass movements in the streets to demand justice for all Black people that have been murdered and brutalized by the state and by this country. Since Black people have been stolen from Africa, this has been a long tradition of the United States government. So when we see the government and the capitalist ruling class responding to the uprisings of 2020 by sending military and National Guard troops against the very people they claim to protect and serve, which is obviously a lie, and shows their hypocrisy. When they send police to bring violence to protests by releasing tear gas, using rubber bullets, using real bullets, using military tactics against people that are peacefully organizing and protesting for justice. We see that this is the moral value of the United States government, and it's completely unacceptable. And we as people of good morals have to stand up against this. I saw a video of one of our comrades, Joel, who's being falsely accused and is sitting behind bars today. I've heard that he has a newborn child at home. I've heard that he's one of the people that have moved so many people to join the fight and struggle for liberation and to join the Party for Socialism and Liberation. At a demonstration where he was listing the demands that the protesters had, he said that we will not be intimidated by your unconstitutional, tyrannical use of force. And I think this is the exact spirit that we have to embody. So our comrades were arrested for speaking out and standing up against the terror machine that is the Denver Police Department and the United States government, for organizing the mass movement of people in the streets against anti-Black violence and against anti-human state violence. Elijah McClain was a 23-year-old Black man who was murdered by Nathan Woodyard, Jason Rosenblatt, and Randy Roedema. They said their body cameras were knocked off during a struggle with McClain, where he was being forcibly held to the ground with his hands cuffed behind his back when an officer choked him to death. And a paramedic administered ketamine to McClain to sedate him, and he went into cardiac arrest and died. This is what our comrades were organizing a mass movement around. They wanted the police to be held accountable, and now they're being targeted and repressed by the state. They were hunted down by the police because they're so threatened. They're so threatened by our ability to be organized against their oppression. I read that Elijah's mom moved him and her family from Denver to Aurora to protect him from gang violence because she saw his gentleness and she didn't want him to be corrupted by whatever community she thought that she was in. I don't know if it ever crossed her mind that the police department would be the gangsters that murdered her son. The new assassination of political leaders and organizers is incarceration, which is why these serious charges are being brought against our comrades, and why we have to stand in solidarity with them until their release. Thank you again for coming today.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. What's the call?
Free 'em all.
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 Say drop the charges.
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 And we're going to keep the movement moving on. I want to thank Sarah so much for speaking with us, and I'm glad she pointed out that some of these folks who were arrested, they're still locked up. And I believe it was Russell who just had a newborn child, and so taken away from that, a new parent. People completely having their lives interrupted, all because they had the audacity to protest racist police terror. And so we're going to keep the program moving on, but before we keep the program moving on, I actually wanted to make a point about how the connection between racist police terror and the political repression that we're seeing in Denver and have seen across the country. And to understand that, we really have to understand the role that police play under a capitalist system. And as I always say, when the police say that they're here to protect and serve, they're telling the truth. But what they're serving is the interests of the ruling class, the wealthy, and what they're protecting is their property. So that's why the uprisings were going on. You saw people caring more about shattered windows and property than they did about human life. And so that's why we see this sort of mistreatment. It's the same connection. And we know that the police as an institution emerges out of slavery. And so this role that they play in protecting property has been true ever since black people were property in this country. And so we have to bear that in mind. As long as the capitalist system itself is in place, we will continue to see this terror and we will continue to see this repression. But I want to bring up our next speaker who will be joining us today. Please join me in welcoming Michael. Welcome him as he comes.
Thank you, comrade. I just want to draw attention to the fact, and I want us to remember the fact of why they did this and how they did this. Using an MRAP, a military-designed tank, essentially, SWAT team. This is an attack, this is a threat, this is a terror attack, right? They want us to see it. They wanted those anti-racist organizers who were out, who were fighting, to be caught in their home, to be caught in a parking lot while they're at work, or to be caught while they're driving. They don't want you to feel safe anywhere. It's not just an attack on those few people who are arrested. It is a threat against every single person who has been involved. It is reminding you that you are not safe. It is reminding you that you could be arrested in your home. You could be arrested at work. You could be arrested at school. You could be arrested in your car while you're driving. They know where people are. They know how to find you. There was one anti-racist organizer elsewhere who was arrested because they could identify her from her shirt. They went on Etsy. They took a few minutes and they went on Etsy. They figured out the seller of her shirt and they were able to arrest her with that. They have been doing this for decades. They've been doing this to protesters who were in Ferguson and Baltimore 5 years ago. They're going to continue to do it. We need to be aware of that they know us. They come after people, and it is a threat against every single person who is involved in anti-racist organizing. They want you to see it. They want you to be scared, right? So those people who were arrested, it's a threat against them. It's a terror attack against them, because having a tank, having a SWAT team roll up on your house is terrifying. And knowing that your comrade has been arrested like that is also terrifying. And there are hundreds of people who were organized, who were there, who were present, who are now aware of it. And there are thousands and millions of people across the country who are now aware of just how threatening they can be. They want us to be scared, and we cannot be scared. We need to keep the fight going, because the fact that they did this tells us that they are also scared, right? This is not over. They feel comfortable doing it, but they feel comfortable and they feel scared, okay? Just because they feel comfortable doing it doesn't mean that it's over. We need to remember that. We need to remember that this is a long history of attacking on trumped up charges. People like Angela Davis and Assata Shakur, and people who are still political prisoners to this day, like Leonard Peltier, right? This is going to keep going. This is why we need to fight this. This stuff cannot end. This stuff needs to end. They won't stop unless we stop them, okay? These are terrorists. They don't serve and protect us. They're not on our side. They're not here to protect anybody but property. We need to remember that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Drop the charges. Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges. Drop
Drop the charges.
the charges.
Drop the charges.
Stop the repression. Stop the repression. Stop the repression. What?
Stop the repression.
Say it.
Stop the repression.
Say it.
Stop the repression.
What?
Stop the repression.
What?
Stop the repression.
Say it.
Stop the repression.
Say it. Stop the repression. 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 You know, it's important that we understand what's happening in Denver for the terror that it is. And I'm glad Michael raised that point. Because what we're really seeing is an attempt to scare the movement into submission. They want to scare us into just, rolling back, being afraid, putting us in a position of cowardice, because they want us to think that if we have the audacity to stand up for what's right, if we have the audacity to organize and demonstrate against white supremacy, against racist police terror, and all these contradictions of the capitalist system, they want us to be afraid that we could be arrested and put in jail or put in prison and put in all these sorts of things, or to be hurt physically. But I think that they don't know who they're messing with. And what do I mean when I say that? I was describing earlier, and I know some of you have seen as well, we've seen the depth of repression that the state has levied against protesters here in DC, in Denver, and across the country, right? But we also see racist vigilante violence. We had a 17-year-old militia member, Kyle Rittenhouse, murdered 2 people in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And what happened? Did the movement go back inside? Did it shrink away? Were people afraid? No, they came back the very next day in force, just like they had been. The same way people came back in force after police repression. And so this movement is not a cowardly movement. If the President of the United States himself can't direct enough violence to stop the movement, if racists who collaborate with these fascist elements, if they aren't enough to stop the movement, then neither will this open repression. And so we have to bear that in mind. And I also want to point something else out. What happened in Denver is a prime example of how fake this dynamic is between so-called peaceful protesters and so-called violent protesters. We see that a lot, right? Well, if we look at the folks who were arrested in Denver, these are not people who were, engaging in property damage or any of that stuff. They were protesting in the way that, we're told we're supposed to, right? But yet they're still facing this repression. So we see that this whole conversation, this whole, fake dynamic around quote-unquote peaceful and who's quote-unquote violent, it's all just a ruse to undermine the movement itself. And so that's why we have to have the courage of our convictions, we have to have the courage of our principles, and to keep moving forward. But we're going to keep the program moving today. And next up, our next speaker that we're going to have, please join me in welcoming Josh. Please welcome him as he comes.
Thank you, Sean, for that wonderful introduction. I wanted to point out something that Sean said, that these tactics are meant to scare us. He's not wrong, he's totally right. I used to be an organizer with the Students for Justice in Palestine at GW, where I, along with many others, introduced a resolution to call on our university to divest from Israeli apartheid, to divest from the companies that profit from the apartheid regime that harms Palestinians. And as a member of that organization, as a member of that force which called for divestment, we were harassed by not only by Zionist groups at large and white supremacist groups at large, but also by specific groups which came to our campus to intimidate us, to scare us out of voting for this resolution, to scare us out of organizing for BDS. And it worked, and to an extent it worked. And one of our meetings was canceled because these Zionists threatened violence against us, because they are there to stop us. It is just like that violence that I experienced on campuses and organizers that these organizers, the anti-race organizers in Denver are facing. This violence is only meant to scare them out of calling for a good cause, for a cause that is not only something worth fighting for, but it's something that is also working. They wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't working. If those groups didn't think that our resolution, that our actions on campus were going to work, if they thought that it was just something that a bunch of kids were doing, they wouldn't have been trying to scare us. They wouldn't have been trying to do that. And none of this, the violence that we face is nothing in comparison to the violence that our comrades in Denver face, or our comrades in Palestine face, as a result of these apartheid regime which aims to keep them under control. So, Palestine. In Palestine, dissidents, people who organize for their own liberation, are routinely rounded up and placed in Israeli jails and prisons and kept there with no idea when they're going to get out, or if they're going to get out at all, just like our comrades in Denver are. These phony charges, these tactics are transnational, and they're transnational because of the white supremacist global reach of the United States and its imperialist power, its imperialist hegemony. And so we also have to realize that these tactics are as transnational, also transnational because there is a growing transnational movement against apartheid, against white supremacy, and against racist police violence that as people around the world, as workers around the world, that we can rebel against. Again, they're only doing this because they know that it's working. Anyway, solidarity with Palestine, solidarity with the Denver comrades. We will win. Venceremos.
What's the call?
Free 'em all.
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 I said, what's the call?
Free 'em all.
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 All right, y'all, real quick. We're going to take a quick pause. We're going to shift down slightly our demonstration. We're just going to get a little bit past this white line right here on the street. All right? So if everybody could just move down past this white line right here. We're going to move down here. What's the call?
Freedom all.
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 Drop the charges!
Drop the charges.
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 Absolutely, and we know that what we're seeing in Denver is nothing new, and our next speaker is going to break down some more of those dynamics, give us some of the context of what we're seeing in Denver and how these things have played out historically against the movement there. So I want you all to help me welcome Patrick Osterguy as he comes to speak. Welcome him as he comes.
Hello everybody. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming out, showing solidarity with our comrades in Denver. And I also wanted to point out another thing. A lot of people like to think, or like to say, that we need to vote for the Democrats to keep us safe and defend us from political repression. But the political establishment in Colorado, and especially Denver, is Democrat from the bottom to the top.
Right.
The governor, a Democrat. The legislature, Democrat. The Denver mayor, also a Democrat. The city councils of Aurora and Denver, majority Democrat. So, the Democrats, they can politically repress us just fine by themselves. They don't need any help from Donald Trump, except to use him as a scapegoat. And that was the problem in Colorado and what our comrades were doing in Colorado. They were taking political power, they were putting it in the hands of the people, and they were taking it to the streets. And that is what scared the politicians and the police in Denver. They weren't just scared, they were embarrassed.
Exactly.
They surrounded the Aurora police station, and the cops, they had to call Lillian on the phone and ask, pretty please, would you please go away? But they stood strong with their demands that they weren't going to leave until the cops that murdered Elijah McClain were arrested and charged. And ultimately, it took tanks and rubber bullets to disperse the people and get them to leave. That was how determined our comrades and the people in Colorado were. And that's what they're being punished for their determination to justice. Not for any kidnapping or theft or anything. They want to make an example of people who are determined to fight for justice. We're not going to let them make examples of our comrades. They're going to be freed. That will happen. Also, the police, they were scared. They were scared that they were going to be held accountable by the people. This is not the first time this has happened in Colorado. In 1969, the Latino people of Colorado were fighting back against white supremacy in the Denver public education system. They peacefully demonstrated. This was a demonstration that was led and organized by students, by the young Latino people in Denver. It was a peaceful demonstration, and they were met with brutal terrorism from the police. They were tear gassed, they were beaten, they were shot at. This dispersed the demonstration at first. Their leaders were arrested. They were taken to downtown Denver. But this didn't stop the people, the Latino people of Denver, for fighting against white supremacy. They marched to downtown Denver and they surrounded a Denver police station, and they demanded that their leaders and that their comrades would be released without charge immediately. It took hours, but they didn't stand down. They didn't back down. They stood strong, and ultimately, their demands were met. This scares the police and the politicians in Denver. They don't want to be held accountable by the people again. They're trying to stop it, and it's not going to stop. We're going to fight back even harder. And that's something called the West High Blowout, 1969. So, we're gonna fight back.
Right.
We're not gonna be scared. We're gonna free our comrades in Denver. And we're gonna win their release. Thank you.
What's the call? What's the call? What's the call? What's the call? Patrick just used a very important word when he was describing the mood and attitude of District Attorney Dave Young and the police there in Aurora, in Denver, and that's embarrassment. We have to understand this assault on the protesters as retaliation. Because if there's one thing that public officials in this country and underneath this system, is one thing they can't stand is looking bad. They can't stand anything that may impugn their credibility or their image. But imagine the kind of person you have to be. Instead of doing the right thing, instead of bringing charges against the officers that choked Elijah McClain to death, which is the most basic of demands, instead of doing that, you arrest anti-racist protesters who are demanding that your office do something about this issue. That is a system that we're living under. And it's not just in Denver, it's not just in DC, It's the whole capitalist system that we have here in the United States. And so a part of what makes this action today special is we have people who are friends of Joel, who know Joel personally. I love this sign right here. It says DC loves Joel. And we're actually going to hear from a person who's not only a comrade of Joel, but someone who's a friend of Joel, who's going to tell us about what's been happening here and what the impact has been. So please join me in welcoming Yasmin Zara from U.S. Labor Against the War. Give her a hand as she comes.
All right, what's up, everyone? I just want to come on here to share a couple words about our brother Joel. He's one of the organizers who was arrested. And many of you may know Joel from Occupy DC. He was very involved in Occupy. And I don't toss these words around lightly, but Joel is an incredible human being. He's someone who has fiercely dedicated his life to the fight for racial justice and has always been in the trenches, community organizing, standing with the struggles for poor and oppressed people here in this country and around the world. He's someone who we can always rely on. He's always had our backs. He's always showed up. None of this stuff is important to the case, but I'm mentioning it because police tend to go on an assassination campaign, a character assassination campaign, and vilify the victims. And in the lead up to Joel's arrest, that's exactly what they did. So this past week, Denver police rolled up in a military tank with military-grade weapons, and a SWAT team raided his home after refusing to show an arrest warrant. Multiple other organizers were rounded up and arrested in their cars at a time when the organizers were alone, when there was nobody around to film the crimes of the Denver police. And these organizers have been charged with felony after felony. They've stacked it up, claiming that the organizers have incited riots, that they've kidnapped the police because they've organized massive marches in Denver that surrounded the police department. And the flashy way that they've conducted this arrest, all of this is to send us a message, not just in Denver, but to organizers across the country. It's a scare tactic, right? When you have a bunch of cop cars and a literal tank in the community, it's to scare the community, to let the community know that there is someone who is a criminal in this area. They're trying to create a narrative about our movement leaders. This is all stuff that we've seen and again in our history. For folks who have been fighting racial justice for decades, this is nothing new. We know in Denver, they brutally murdered Elijah McClain, put him in a chokehold, and lied about him reaching for a gun. They also lied to the EMTs, as the sister mentioned. This all went viral because of organizers like Joel and others, our other comrades, these brave souls who told the truth, who spoke up about what was going on, about the injustice in Denver. And the police were exposed. They were embarrassed. They embarrassed the police chief publicly on video. It's all recorded. And for them, this is payback. This is not about doing what's right. This is about payback. And that's exactly why they're holding Joel and others. These felonies are serious, and it's on all of us. We have to push back. We have to raise hell, and we have to fight like hell. So when I say justice for Elijah, I want you to say, Denver police lie. Justice for Elijah.
Denver police lie.
Justice for Elijah.
Denver police
Say
lie.
justice for Elijah.
Denver police 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 lie.
All right, this is a moment where we gotta get involved, right? We have to be an organization. The only reason we know about Joel and the others is because they're connected to powerful working class organizations like the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I'm a proud member of the PSL. We've been leading massive marches across the country to fight police terror, to hold these murderous killer cops accountable. And if you're really real about the struggle for liberation, about the struggle for Black lives, find someone in a red shirt and get involved. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, Yasmin. Say, drop the charges. Drop the charges. Drop the charges. Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
Drop the charges.
One thing that Yasmin said that was so important, and I think that's a running theme throughout our action today, is how we must continue to resist. We must continue to fight back. We know that repression breeds resistance, and that resistance breeds repression, which is precisely what happened to Joel Northrum, Russell Roosh, Eliza Lucero, and Lillian House. But we have to continue to do what they were doing. We have to keep the pressure on. That's the only way that will get the changes that we seek, and the only way that we'll be able to see these anti-racist protesters get what they deserve, to get the freedom that they deserve, is as if there's an organized movement to keep up the fight. And so now, I want to bring up our next speaker for today. Please join me in welcoming Cambridge.
Hey, I'm not going to be long. I just wanted to say a couple of things. One of those things is that we must continue to organize. We must struggle with our Denver comrades. That means staying in these streets and knowing that at the end of the day, the Democrats are not going to support us. Nope. They are complicit. Every party in this system is complicit. So that means that if we want change, we must organize. And we make sure that we're organizing with people that's looking to bring down this system. Okay? And that's all I have to say.
All right, thank you so much, Cambridge. That's an important point. The political mainstream has no solution for any of these issues. They have no answer for racist police terror outside of some, reforms, which we can support, certainly, but don't get to the heart of the matter. They are offering no real solution to the coronavirus pandemic. I mean, this government gave Wall Street endless money, gave the banks endless money to try to jumpstart this economy, but through you and I, crumbs. And that's why there's about 55 million people who have filed for unemployment in this country since the pandemic escalated. We have people facing evictions. We have a climate catastrophe. I mean, the West Coast was on fire, the skies red, the air hazy. So why don't we hear from our so-called leaders about this? Well, it's because all of those issues I just named and so many more are contradictions of the capitalist system. And the Democrats and Republicans are a part of the ruling class that is sworn to protect that system. So if we're going to see any real lasting solution to these problems, that means that the capitalist system itself has to be removed as the dominant force. And this is what we must keep in mind. And so now, I want to bring up our next speaker. Please join me in welcoming Sabina. Give her a hand as she comes.
Hi everyone, how are you doing? As my comrades have mentioned earlier today, I just want to say it again. This was a Democratic DA, Dave Young, who again will not charge the killer cops who murdered Elijah McClain, a 23-year-old black man. Instead, they're charging activists who are anti-racist organizers, and they're charging them with cooked up felony charges. This is a clear attack on organizers who are fighting against the brutal racist system, this capitalist system that doesn't care about black and brown people, not only here, but also abroad. They came to organizers' homes and showed up with MRAPs, military vehicles that are the very same military vehicles that were used in the Iraq War. This is all connected. This is part of the global capitalist imperialist system that both targets, surveils, and murders and harasses and tries to intimidate us both here and abroad. And we're saying no. We're saying we're gonna keep fighting back. We're not gonna let that scare us. We're gonna still be out in the streets, and we are in solidarity with our comrades in Colorado. And we also notice that the same thing is happening here, just like what my comrades mentioned before. The Democratic mayor, Muriel Bowser, literally allowed the police department to come and throw tear gas and rubber bullets and attack protesters right here at Black Lives Matter Plaza, so-called Black Lives Matter Plaza. But when people stand up and they say that the police need to stop murdering black people, this is what happens. And both the Democrats and the Republicans are complicit in this. They enable it. So what we need to do is work together. We need to organize together. The working class needs to come together, both here and abroad. And that's what people have been doing. And we see that it works. We know it works because when we do this and when we fight back and organize, the police come after and try to target organizers. But we're not gonna let that scare us. We're gonna keep organizing. We're gonna fight back even harder. So when I say drop the charges, you say drop the charges. Drop the charges!
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 All right, thank you so much, Sabina. What's the call?
Freedom all!
What's the call?
Freedom all!
What's the call?
Freedom all!
What's the call?
Freedom
I
all!
said, what's the call?
Freedom all!
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 All right, we're getting ready to wrap up here in a second, but this will be an ongoing thing. We'll continue to struggle for justice for the anti-racist protesters and organizers in Denver. We'll continue to fight against political repression wherever we see it, be it here in DC, be it in Colorado, be it in Portland, wherever we find it. We have a duty to push back against it because we know that it could just as easily be any of us. And I think we also need to be clear about something. We wouldn't be seeing these attacks on protesters if the act of resistance itself, if the demonstration itself wasn't working. People love to tell you and I, oh, y'all out there marching again, y'all out there demonstrating again, y'all out there rallying. That don't do nothing. Well, if that's the case, then why is the state locking people up on these charges? Why are federal officers disappearing people into vans? Why are both wings of the political mainstream knocking themselves out to see who can be the most brutal against activities that I thought were supposed to be protected under the Constitution they uphold so much? So don't let anyone lie to you and tell you that what you do doesn't matter or doesn't work. The great Frederick Douglass once said that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, it never will. So this is our demand for today. And so last but not least, our final speaker for today, one of our great local educators and a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, please join me in welcoming Gladys.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am very happy to see you all out here supporting this really important cause. This is the time for us to rebel against oppression and the U.S. police state. This is why we're all here. As many of my comrades have mentioned, the city of Denver is a Democratic city. The DA is a Democrat. So do not be fooled by the masks they wear. If you choose to move against them and not agree with them, they will come for you. They have proven it. Us standing here together is showing solidarity with our comrades in Denver and telling them we will not be silent, we will not be complacent, we will not allow them to disappear and silence our voice. This is not the first time that this has happened in history. It has happened throughout time. when we stand up and say, no, it is not okay to murder people. No, it is not okay to silence us. They come and try to oppress us and arrest us. So we are standing strong together, demonstrating that our voices will not be silenced. We will not be held down. We will not stop rallying. We will fight them to the very end. I wanted to share a poem with you, written by a German pastor during World War II, about the Nazi oppressions happening. Give me 1 second, I'm sorry.
What's the call?
Freedom all!
What's the call?
Freedom all!
The poem is called First They Came. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. Will this be our fate? Will we allow this to happen in this country?
Hell no!
I say no. I want you all to know that I will not be silenced by their terror. I will not be quieted. Will you do the same?
Yes!
Thank you.
Drop the charges!
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 Drop
Drop the
the charges!
charges!
Drop the charges!
What's the call?
Freedom all!
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 That's right, and what Gladys was just speaking to was so important, that we have solidarity with each other. And the best way to do that is to be organized. You might be brilliant, you might be bad, I don't doubt that, but you will not be able to overturn this system and have a real answer to these injustices all by yourself. You must be organized. And so we got a last minute addition to our roster, a speaker we're going to bring up now. Please join me in welcoming Max Blumenthal, editor of the Gray Zone.
I actually didn't expect to speak. I just showed up. So I was just thinking on the way about experiencing something somewhat similar to what our friends, our brothers and sisters in Denver just experienced, which was last year. I had a team of DC police show up at my house. Surrounding the house, I was listed as armed and dangerous, and they demanded entry to my home and said they would break the door down if I didn't let them in. I let them in. They gave me a few minutes to put on some clothes. They threw me in a van, and I was off to jail for 2 days under false charges of assaulting a 59-year-old pregnant woman. Now, aside from Sarah Palin, I've never heard of a 59-year-old pregnant woman, but this was a highly unusual situation where 5 months after this bogus accusation was made, a warrant was executed, and the accusation was made outside the Venezuelan embassy, where many of you participated in a internationally legal attempt to hold off Juan Guaido's white-collar mafia. And so this allegation was fabricated by a proxy force of the Trump administration, a right-wing proxy force of the Trump administration, not dissimilar from the Boogaloo Boys, who are being used by the police and the feds to do the things that the police and the feds have been unable to do to leftist, anti-imperialist, anti-fascist protesters. And now it becomes clear what was taking place. The charges against me were ultimately dropped. What was taking place, why I was listed as armed and dangerous, why I was basically swatted by the federal government in the US versus Max Blumenthal. Now it's very clear that the Trump administration, police forces across the country, are enacting a program of political retaliation against their
perceived ideological enemies, and they are terrorizing anyone who effectively stands in their way. And let's be clear, what took place in Aurora was a very effective action that should be celebrated by anyone who believes in civil liberties. It was a beautiful action. It's what needs to take place everywhere across this country where police are given impunity. And that's why we saw this retaliation against our friends there. And it was so much more extreme than what I witnessed, because we saw an MRAP and a tank roll up on Joel Northam's house. What was the need for that, except that they, as Madeleine Albright said about the US Army, if you have such a big army, you might as well use it. What was the purpose of that? Pure intimidation. Right. So the only thing to do here is to redouble our efforts, to escalate, to say we're not intimidated, we're not afraid of the police state. We are going to escalate our legitimate legal activity against police impunity, police terror, and this program of retaliation across the country. Bill Barr the other day said that the Black Lives Matter movement doesn't care about black lives. This corpulent, undead, Jabba the Hutt impersonator, along with Mike Pompeo, sat there and said that the Black Lives Movement doesn't care about black lives. They're just using black lives for a wider program to destroy our democratic society. It's actually the inverse. It's actually the other way around. Bill Barr and his cronies, and Muriel Bowser, who has demanded that the Trump administration act in a more draconian fashion against the Black Lives Matter movement here in DC, are using Black Lives Matter for a wider program of suppressing and destroying the political left, the anti-fascist movement, and the anti-imperialist movement in the United States, not unlike J. Edgar Hoover's FBI did during COINTELPRO in the 1960s. So again, the whole point of being here is to stand up against this, to get together and resolve that we will redouble our actions. And when I came out of prison, when I came out of jail into the courtroom, I can tell you that a lot of my friends who are here today were in that courtroom waiting for me. They were there to show me support, and that's what we need to do for our brothers and sisters in Denver. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Max Blumenthal. I mean, he said a couple of things I think are so important. He talked about how the police not only carry out terror against political dissent, not only do they carry out racist police terror, they also help facilitate U.S. imperialism. And so that is why we have to continue to develop this movement. And it also made me think about how important it is that we amplify what is happening in Denver. Because if you notice, there's really been no major news coverage of what is happening there. It's only been more progressive and left-leaning independent media platforms that have been talking about this. And so it's really integral that we have journalists who are brave enough, who have the integrity to talk about these things realistically. And I'd like to bring up one such person real quick before we head out today. Please join me in welcoming Anya Parampil from Red Lions.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you everyone for being here today. I was following what was happening in Aurora at the time when, as Max said, a very effective protest was led by the PSL outside of the Aurora Police Department. Because I thought at a time when there was so much chaos in the streets, and the media was really trying to capitalize on that in some ways and try and paint the demonstrators around the country during the largest protest this country has seen in its history, and now its most sustained, as without direction or violent. And Aurora, especially the individuals who are now in jail, proved that there was clear direction to the demonstrations, and they were peaceful. They were very clearly targeting the killer cops responsible for the death, the murder of Elijah McClain. And I saw that video of Lillian House outside of the police department speaking with the police chief. They actually forced the police chief to get on the phone with protesters outside of the district. When have we ever seen something like that? I thought that was an example of a tactic, this occupation, peaceful occupation of the district, that could have been replicated and should be still around the country during times such as what we're experiencing now. They provided a model for all of us. And they really, what they did, their only crime was humiliating the Aurora Police Department. Whether it was that day when the police chief told Lillian she didn't have the power to fire the killer cops, or when I've seen other videos of the individuals now jailed, including Joel, naming the names of the cops responsible for the murder of Elijah McClain in the streets. In another video I saw, Joel himself was leading a demonstration and talking about the fact that the cops that day had released lies about their protest, saying that undercover cops had heard that demonstrators were planning on rushing the police department. And it was a lie. Joel said it there on video. They're lying about us to criminalize our peaceful demonstrations. And look what's happened now. They've taken that to the extreme. They've accused the people who were simply occupying this space outside of the department to force the arrest of people responsible for murder, people who mocked a 23-year-old as he lied dying on the ground. They're trying to accuse those people of kidnapping, of trying to plot the kidnapping of police. This is just outrageous. And these charges cannot stand. We around the country have to show that we reject this criminalization of protest, and that we stand with the people inside of that jail, and that the cops are very clearly lying about the people who led the most effective protest. There's a reason these people were targeted, and that's why. It's because, again, they provided a model for all of us. And so I think we have to remember that the cops were truly embarrassed by what took place in Aurora. They charged on peaceful demonstrators playing violin and pepper sprayed them. That's the only riot I saw in Aurora. It was a police riot. And our friends, Joel, Lillian, and the rest, they were out there exposing the behavior of the police and standing up for justice. So when we see people like them behind bars, it should only encourage more of us to come out in the streets. And I just want to say one last thing. Throughout the Trump administration, I've heard a lot of talk from people about opposing fascism and standing up to Trump. But these are the people who are doing it. These are the people doing the work. And these are the people who do the work regardless of who is in office, because they understand that justice for Black lives or an anti-war policy is not going to come by voting in a Democrat. It's going to come from organizing in communities and doing exactly the work that our friends, our brothers and sisters in Denver and Aurora were up to. So we stand with them, drop the charges, and I believe that we'll win this one.
Thank you so much, Anya. What's the call? 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 Drop the charges! 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 And that's what we're going to continue to do. We're going to continue to fight until they drop the charges against Russell Roosh, Lillian House, Eliza Lucero, and Joe Northrum. I want to thank you all so much for coming out today on behalf of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Before you go, we want to get a picture with everybody. So if everyone, I guess, gather like in front of this tree right here, I think somebody who's like taking the picture maybe should direct folks. But we will be taking a picture here. So don't run off just yet. We want to make sure we want folks to know about this support, about this action that we're having so we can keep this thing moving. Again, I've been Sean Blackman with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Peace if you're willing to fight for it, and let your motto be resistance. Thank you.
Yeah, so should we go like in the shade, you think?
Yeah, as long as the sun's behind,
So is this
should be good. If everybody wouldn't mind, maybe slide over, I don't know, wherever everybody wants. I'll do it quick. Okay. Scoot it in. What's the call? Freedom! Thank you. Are we good?
I got it.
Socialism sucks. 100 million people.
But honestly, even just doing it energizes.
Sean, before I close out my live stream, could I have you talk to my audience for a second?
Yeah, absolutely.
So to anybody who kind of just like tuned in late or doesn't kind of know the context of it, could you just briefly kind of explain what happened in Colorado?
Absolutely. Well, basically, in Denver, there were several protesters, anti-racist protesters, who were arrested. And at least 4 of them were people who had helped lead massive peaceful demonstrations around the Aurora Police Department, demanding justice around the police killing of 23-year-old Elijah McClain, a black man who was killed by Aurora police in August of 2019. They were demanding that the Office of Democratic District Attorney Dave Young do something about this. And this was Joel Northrum, Lillian House, Liza Lucero, and Russell Roosh. And these are people, they were arrested, in a Home Depot parking lot. I believe Joel's house had a SWAT team show up. People were pulled over and arrested. This was clearly a coordinated assault of retaliation because of the pressure and of the embarrassment that Dave Young's office and the police had been feeling because of the mass movement that had come into the streets to demand justice for Elijah as a part of this broader swell of protests of racist police terror that's been happening in the country for months now. And these are some very serious charges. Some people are facing felony charges of riot charges, felony theft, kidnapping. Some people are facing because they stood outside of the police department, and I guess that counts as holding police hostages. I mean, it's just so absurd on its face. But this is clearly not just retaliation against those individual organizers. It's also clearly something that is supposed to send a message. This was meant to have a chilling effect on the movement for Black lives. And that's why we've seen that like we've seen in Denver. That's why we've seen the deep police repression all across the country. We've seen racist vigilante violence, like in the case of Kyle Rittenhouse, who murdered 2 people in Kenosha. But what people should keep in mind is that despite that state violence, which is ordered by Democrats and Republicans, and despite racist vigilante violence, people have still been in the streets, people still have not been cowed. And so what this means to me is that in this moment, it's important that we don't give in to cowardice, that we don't give in to fear, that we be as courageous as those protesters in Denver and keep our foot on the gas and keep up the pressure until we get not only the justice that we seek, but until we can have a new society and a new system where racist police terror and systemic white supremacy are no longer characteristic.
I didn't hear a lot of love for the Democrats today.
Well,
can you
yeah.
talk about, people seem to think that maybe the Democrats are kind of the antidote to Trump and his, policies, etc. Where do you see differently?
Well, certainly they're trying to frame themselves that way. And if you notice, if we look at the national situation, right? It's September, the U.S. presidential elections will be in November, right? And so, if you look at the Democratic Party, the ticket of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they're not really offering any program. They're not speaking to any of the most pressing issues that impact the masses of poor, working, and oppressed people in the United States. Their main campaign plank is that I am not Donald J. Trump. Therefore, you should vote for me. Now, people should remember that Hillary Clinton tried that same thing in 2016 and still lost. And she was, and you know, she's a garbage candidate, but is light years ahead of Joe Biden. You see what I mean? And even if we look at who Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are, this is a center-right, law and order ticket. Now, why do I say that? Because Joe Biden is one of the architects of the modern mass incarceration state. And Kamala Harris bragged about being the top cop in California. She called herself that. She bragged about attacking poor and working class black families through her truancy policies and things like that. And so that is why we see Democrats and Republicans facilitating this repression against protesters, because they're clear that these demonstrations, this movement against racism, is as much a threat to Democrats' power as it is to Donald Trump. The difference with Trump and Pence and that wing of the Republicans is they don't even pretend to be anything except the reactionaries that they are. They don't pretend to be anything except the, uniquely repugnant bigots and xenophobes that they are. But it's the Democrats who try to perpetrate this mass ruse every 4 years. And so we're never supposed to ask for anything because we're supposed to get the boogeyman out, whether it's Trump or George W. Bush or whoever. But we have to say no more. We have to begin to organize for ourselves and build organizations and join organizations that want to completely overturn the system and bring about a society that is based on the development and sustaining of humanity and not the maximization of profit.
Thank you, I really appreciate it.
Thank you, appreciate you.
Okay, so this was sort of the beginning of what I think could be a kind of long day of various activism in Washington, D.C. As the caption described, this is a group called the Party for Socialism and Liberation. They're a small third party that calls for socialism. And specifically, they're out here today talking about basically the police arrests of people who support the Black Lives Matter movement, but especially protesters who were arrested in Colorado and charged with felonies related to recent activism there. So I will have some HD footage from this up later, as well as I actually plan to be out at the Supreme Court, where people continue to mourn the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I'll be out there later. I'll have some HD footage from this. I also anticipate an anti-police protest happening tonight at 7 p.m. So lots of different activity that I'll be live streaming on especially Facebook and Twitter, but probably YouTube as well. So thanks for watching.